Hello, thank you for joining in. I'm Dr. Robert McEachnie. I'm in the history department at UNC Charlotte, and this is our first attempt at taking our kind of public lectures that we've been doing for the past few years and moving them online to reflect our current situation. And as a result of that, I got asked to do this first one because it seems somewhat relevant on an ancient pandemic. So I want to thank Twig Branch for helping to arrange that, and for the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences for supporting this project. What I want to talk about today is an ancient pandemic, right? So we are in a current pandemic when I'm recording this of COVID-19. But this lecture that I'm going to give, I've been giving for 7 years in one form or another, and plagues were not uncommon in the ancient world. And based on our experience, they're not so uncommon in the modern either. Since I wrote this lecture 7 years ago, at the beginning I've mentioned Ebola, SARS, Zika, Ebola again, and now COVID-19 as diseases which threaten our everyday life. But plagues have moved over human civilization as long as there's been a human civilization for bacteria and viruses to use as a host. And understanding how plagues move, infect, and affect human society is a complicated process which forces us to wrestle with not just the science, but with human responsibility in causing plagues and in interpreting them. Diseases are not just products of lab or things seen under a microscope. They're socially, culturally, and psychologically experienced, as we are all experiencing right now. And to understand a plague, we must look beyond just the biological reality of a virus or a bacteria to study how people react and are changed by the disease. And so if we go to the ancient world to look at this, diseases were an ever-present reality in ancient life. Cramped conditions, no antibiotics, lack of hygienic standards meant illness was normal. But plague was something different. Plagues were still exceptional. Just like we have diseases regularly, a pandemic is something different, as we've all experienced. So in the ancient world, we can point to the Athenian plague of 430 BCE, Galen's plague in 170, the plague of Cyprian in North Africa, which played a role in the spread of Christianity. And then in the medieval period, the Black Death, Spanish influenza in the 20th century. All of these stand apart from traditional illnesses. So they require a different understanding from people who survived and later history writers. What caused such a disaster and how does it change us? The plague I want to look at today is associated with the Emperor Justinian. And it's named after him, though it's unfair. He catches the disease and survives, but he gets the plague named after him, known as Justinian's plague. It spread initially from Egypt throughout the Roman Empire and beyond, towards Persia, perhaps China, and also westward, perhaps reaching Britain and even Scandinavian countries before dying out. To give you a sense of where we're discussing, this is the Eastern Roman Empire in the 6th century CE. Sometimes called the Byzantine Empire, it was still very Roman in terms of law, culture, and government. It considered itself to be the pinnacle of the world. It was at the center of a host of other kingdoms, which are sometimes referred to as the Byzantine Commonwealth that I can point out on here, at the kingdom of Axum, of Nubia, of Armenia, the Visigoths, the Franks to the west. The empire was a cosmopolitan one with trade goods, and it still occupied the spot as the strongest empire on the block, even undertaken the reconquest of North Africa and Italy in the decade prior. The empire had adapted Christianity almost 200 years, but the result was not a peaceful empire. Disputes about religion between Christians just raged about theology, and the plague would exacerbate and address some of these cultural, economic, and religious issues. Now, the plague bacteria in question that causes this pandemic is this one, Yersinia pestis. And although several origins have been proposed, Egypt, China, East Africa, the one that I find most convincing has the bacteria originating in East Africa at the beginning of the 6th century, and I'll discuss that in a minute. But the bacterium is carried by fleas that bite rats. In fact, this bacterium, Yersinia pestis, is not normally transmitted by human-to-human contact. And humans don't propagate the bacteria within their bloodstream or body. In some very extreme cases, the disease can be transmitted by contact with bodily fluids from an infected animal or human, but mostly it came by being bitten by a carrier. And this is because the bacterium evolved as a disease of rodents and fleas. The bacterium reproduces in the rat's blood, lying dormant for a week, during which time any flea that bites the rat takes in the bacteria where it lays dormant in the flea. In most situations, the bacteria would not affect humans because the fleas don't desire to bite humans, only rats. Now, this is the same general disease which caused the Black Death in the 4th century and is still present today. We can see the worldwide distribution of plague. But importantly, those three, Justinian, the Black Death, and the modern, are different strains of Yersinia pestis, different genetic strains, and the two earlier ones are extinct, have burned themselves out. And it's one of the reasons why it was so lethal to humans in its first two major outbreaks. The bacteria hadn't evolved to use its human host. Right? If the bacteria ended up in a human, it was, evolutionarily speaking, an accident, right? Because it helped the bacteria not at all. It couldn't reproduce. It couldn't move on to a new host. And from that perspective, bubonic plague in humans was nothing more than a sideshow. But that's exactly why it was so fatal. Diseases which use us well to reproduce tend not to kill us unless they are new. Now, where does this come from is a crucial question. Right? The plague is technically a zooniosis, that is a disease that makes its home in a population of animals, in this case, rats. While today, the dominant rat species is the Norwegian brown rat, in the warmer climates of the Mediterranean, the common black rat that you see here, Ratus ratus, came to dominate. The rat was originally native of India, but slowly spread to the Red Sea, the Mediterranean, beyond during the Roman Republic and Empire. Now, the rat moves slowly on its own. It won't move more than 200 meters during its whole lifespan, but it manages to travel thousands of miles. And that's because their diet mirrors that of humans. And the Silk Road, and more importantly, the cross-Indian Ocean trade through the Red Sea is thus responsible for moving these animals from one place to another. And this is going to be an important piece of our story. The rat does not choose to move from India to Mediterranean. It does not choose to carry the disease, but global trade without proper limits, without proper forward thinking, simply brings these to a new arena, into a new climate, a new milieu, wherein dangers that previously hadn't been expected can come to pass. And so this is going to be an important part of our story. The disease follows rats, which follow large-scale human trade. Now, we should ask a crucial question. Where did the plague come from, and why did the plague emerge at this moment? One of my students makes memes and added this one, and it's a valid question, right? The rat doesn't make the choice. Why does it come to Constantinople in 541? And so we need to ask where it originated. And there are two different competing theories about this. First, that it comes from China. All right, scientists have postulated an origin for the disease in China or in East Africa. China, because we know that the Black Death of the 1400s, or the 1300s, and the bubonic plague, which exists today, and COVID-19, come from the Asian area, that area of Asia. And this would be possible because of the Silk Road and the Indian Ocean trade. The overland route of the Silk Road is unlikely because of the slow movement of goods. That is, there wouldn't be time for the plague to move as quickly as it would need to get new hosts and new environment. But the oversea route is possible. Other scientists have suggested an African origin from the highlands of East Africa near Rwanda, Uganda, which you see on this map. Neither is 100%, but I tend to see the African origin reflected more strongly in the circumstantial evidence. And I understand certain scientists disagree on this for genetic reasons, but the circumstantial evidence, we would expect to see decline in population where it emerges and along its path. We don't have good population records for this area of Africa at the time, but we do have it for circumstantially for the area along the Red Sea, Yemen, Axum, Ethiopia. We don't see population decline in India or along the Silk Road if there's a Chinese origin. We do see it in East Africa. To give you an example, while we lack good written records for the period, circumstantial evidence points to the early collapse of the Axumite, the Ethiopian civilization, around 540. They lost control of their overseas territories in Yemen. The capital moved inland away from trade routes, and perhaps most tellingly, the ivory trade, upon which the Red Sea trade was partially based, declined massively. Whereas from 400 to 540, we have 120 surviving examples of ivory carvings from the region. From 540 to 700, only 6 survive. That's 5%. There's a decimation to the trade that's coming out of there. And so combined with the map of the spread, right, that we can track the written sources where it emerges in Egypt and spreads to the Mediterranean and then back along Mesopotamia and the Euphrates into Persia, I'm fairly confident that the plague has its origins in East Africa generally. But it still doesn't answer the question of why? Why this time? Why did the plague break out suddenly in the 6th century, again in the 14th, and again in the late 19th? And the answer seems to be climactic. The particular flea which carried the bacteria tended to live in a climate with a temperature between 55 and 75 degrees. When warmer, they became more subdued, biting less and spreading the disease less. The narrow range kept the disease in the Gobi Desert or in the East African highlands for many years until sudden environmental changes coincided with new opportunities for advancement. And that sudden change is the dust veil event. And this is a little understood event, but there's been some really good scholarship published on this in the past few years, that in 536, an Icelandic volcano erupted. And this is the same volcano we think that erupted in the early 2000s and displaced air travel for almost a month, if you remember that. But a volcano erupted, lowering temperatures across Europe by 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Celsius, and then again in 540 with a further lowering of 1.4 to 2.7 degrees. That means a 3 to 5 degrees Celsius lowering of average temperatures in 540, 541. So this was not climate change like we experience, but a dust veil, which blocked out enough sunlight to produce cold summers and smaller harvest. Snow fell across Europe in July and August. Irish chronicles record a failure of bread from the years 536 to 539. Tree ring studies confirmed that 540 was the coldest year recorded in thousands of years. And this sudden climatic change allowed the bacteria to leave its isolated home. And here we see how climate's not responsible alone, but all of these things together. If the volcano had happened 2 centuries earlier, the rats would have migrated to warmer locales on the coast and found nothing. But because of the expansion of trade routes, that spread of globalization, we might even say, as a result of increased demand for ivory and foodstuffs for the Aksumite Empire to produce ivory, the rats found ships and a trade route to go north from East Africa to Egypt. Climate change doesn't remake the world on its own, but it causes new tensions on a system which had not been tested before. It's an accelerator of problems and a stress on untested human systems. And that's maybe one of the lessons of this plague and thinking about pandemics is they come from untested ties to new places. The disease traveled north along the Red Sea to the Nile, being first recognized in the city of Pelusium in Egypt, which you see here, a port on the far east of the Nile. It reached Alexandria by September, was quiet through the winter before infecting Constantinople in March or April of 542. By summer, it reached Syria and Antioch. It also moved westward, touching Sicily by late 542, Italy in 543. The illness faded in the Byzantine Empire, evidenced by laws of Justinian in March 543, trying to reestablish normal working conditions. And the plague would return in waves every few years, affecting Constantinople again in 558, 573, and 599, and would occasionally reappear to affect certain areas, but never as widespread as the first wave. And after 750, it vanishes entirely until the Black Death of the 14th century. Now, what I want to focus on for the next few minutes is the city of Constantinople, because it's where we have the best record. Constantinople, modern day Istanbul, previously called Byzantium, is the capital of the Roman world at this time. It has a population of about 500,000, give or take, and is certainly the largest city of the Mediterranean. But we have good documentation from 2 different writers about the experience there. Procopius is the court historian who writes about this plague, and he says, during these times there was a pestilence by which the whole human race came near to being annihilated. Now, in the case of all other scourges sent from heaven, some explanation of the cause might be given by daring men. But for this calamity, it's quite impossible either to express in words or to conceive in thought in any explanation, except indeed to refer it to God. For it did not come in a part of the world, nor upon certain men, nor did it confine itself to any season of the year, so that from such circumstances it might be possible to find subtle explanations of a cause, but it embraced the entire world and blighted the lives of all men, though differing from one another in the most marked degree, respecting neither sex nor age. He gives other descriptions that we'll highlight, but what I want to point out here is that he simply calls it a pestilence. It doesn't have a separate name. It's not a named disease. It is just a supernatural pestilence sent by God for an unclear reason. And that's really how it kind of gets understood, because it's beyond the realm of normal human experience. That's kind of what defines a pandemic or plague as separate from a different disease. It is beyond the realm of normal human experience. And Procopius will blame some people. He blames Justinian, the ruler, which is probably not uncommon. John of Ephesus is another writer of the time, and he suggests that 300,000 people died in Constantinople. That seems unlikely. John's description, though, gives us a bit in terms of symptoms that we'd expect to see. He says, from now on, the common people could be seen to be smitten by a single great and harsh blow and suddenly to fall, apart from a few. Not only those who died, but also those who escaped sudden death were struck with this plague of swellings in their groins with this disease, which they called bubones. Also, we saw that this great plague showed its effect on the animals as well, not only on the domesticated, but also on the wild, and even on the reptiles of the earth. One could see cattle, dogs, and other animals, even rats, with swollen tumors struck down and dying. Now, obviously, what stands out to us here is the rats, but John's description is what helps confirm that it is a version of bubonic plague, which, again, continues to exist today, though in very isolated places associated with animal care. It has also been confirmed by certain genetic testing of the last few years that has really done a good job of showing the genetic strain that is different in the ancient plague from the modern one. But to keep our focus on the people that experience this plague, because that's what is important, is the city of Constantinople. And I tend to think that a lot of ancient numbers are inflated. But even if we account for that, the numbers of infected and dead are huge. We know with relative certainty that Constantinople had a population of 500,000. We can safely assume that a quarter to half got the disease, and the mortality rate of bubonic plague is 40 to 70%. We're operating on guesstimates here. It leaves us with a death toll of 50,000 on the low end, or 175,000 on the high. That's 10 to 35% of the population, all in the summer of, it should be 542. I made a mistake there. But this is akin to the city of New York seeing 1.5 million people die in a single summer, or roughly 70 million across the whole of the United States in a single summer. And that's because this is a wildfire disease. It burns through the population, right, within that 4 months, after which the rat and the human populations were burned out and no longer capable of producing those high infection rates. But during that 100 days, Constantinople was a window into hell. And I don't say this lightly. I recognize, that we are all kind of dealing with the fear of this right now. And I don't mean this to inspire fear. In fact, what was happening in Constantinople was far, far worse. And it's important to think with that context, to think with how it's experienced, right? A plague is not simply a thing isolated in a lab. It is how we experience it. That's what comes to define pandemic and plague. And so for the people in Constantinople, how did they experience it? Well, every day, 1, 2, 5,000 people, 1 in 100 would become infected. A day's moderate fever would be followed by a week of delirium. Bubones would appear under the arms, in the groin, behind the ears, and grow to the size of melons. Right? Edemas of blood swelled lymphatic glands, resulting in extreme pain, and sometimes the bubones would burst in a shower of pus. The pain lasted for a week before the victim began to recover or to die. And those dying had their bodies become weaker and weaker, incapable of replacing the deoxygenated blood. And this is actually one of the things that I want to think about for a second, is the sensual experience of living in Constantinople, whether you have the disease or, just as importantly, if you don't. This is a city, there's very little window glass. So if someone is suffering, you will hear them even from the street. Because the muscles around the voice box become deoxygenated, people that are gasping for breath will literally rasp. And so the sound across the city would have been someone struggling for breath. You combine that with the smell of an ancient city and add on the dying and it not being properly cleaned and being summer. This is a place that is a sensual experience in the midst of pandemic. And so the disease was not an abstract reality, but a sensual one. It was heard, it was smelled, it was felt, and the effect on the people who lived through it should be highlighted. And so a city with a normal rate of death of maybe 50 persons a day suddenly had hundreds dying per day. And this was a practical problem of what to do with the bodies. Because of religious reasons, cremation was out, throwing them in the sea was believed to poison the water. And so Justinian orders that the bodies be thrown into the city wall, to have the stones taken off the top of the Theodosian land walls and the bodies piled in. And this works as potentially a kind of defense mechanism. Your enemies have to come through those dead, poisoned bodies. But Procopius tells us that, quote, an evil stench pervaded the city and distressed the inhabitants still more, especially when the wind blew fresh from that quarter. And so while it's dealing with those bodies, it is not reassuring people. And so while recent advances in historical epidemiology have allowed scientists to prove that the plague of the 6th century was Yersinia pestis, though of a different evolutionary branch than the Black Death, the version of the 6th century seems to have been more lethal than the Black Death even, or certainly of the modern versions of bubonic plague, due to the variation in the genomic sequence that's gone from modern strains. The plague seems to have been so lethal as to burn itself out. Now, we're going to pause here and set up a part 2, and I'll talk next time about how people understand this, right? They're in this terrible situation. How do they respond? Who do they blame? What treatment do they seek? And then importantly, how does the world change, right? How does the world change as a result of the deaths, but also the experience that people have in their treatment? Because that's kind of important for our situation to think about. If you have questions, please submit them or send them on, and we'll have a part 2 to come.